Hello all, I'm Arctic. This is my channel. Come a little bit closer. I want to tell you a story today. A story about what humans can truly persevere. One thing I've realized is that, despite humans being as fragile as they are, we do have a penchant to be cockroaches. And I don't mean that anything bad. I just mean that we can survive and endure a whole lot. Yeah, there's some, a lot of times where some horrible happens, something unimaginable happens, and they just don't end up making it out. But we also see stories of where people do survive, where they do persevere, and they make it through something that is so unimaginable, from just injuries to psychological traumas to just these very intense situations, and were all odds, despite everything, they somehow managed to survive. And I honestly find those stories the most impactful and the most inspiring, because it not only shows that you not only can make it through a hard event, but you can survive and thrive afterwards. And I want to share you a story today, a story we should have never heard. The person who has given us this story, they should have been since passed. They shouldn't have even been around, but they are very much alive and well. They have been able to survive their trauma. They've been able to survive their ordeal. And they've been able to turn that into something beautiful. So today, I want to bring you the story of Mary Vincent. Mary was born in 1963. Growing up in Las Vegas, she was half white, half Filipino. Her father was a mechanic, and her mother was a blackjack dealer on the Vegas Strip. And growing up, she was quite the artist. She was quite the natural talent. She used to dance. She even did a opening segment for the Miss Universe competition held in Las Vegas one year. She was quite the just gifted, and sometimes you run across these people and they're just like, some people have brains, some people have strength and athletic talent, but Mary was just the creative type. And while she had this great, just bubbling, just artistic expression, on the outside it seemed like she was doing really good, but internally she was struggling. See, by 1978, her parents had entered what was described as a very messy divorce. And Mary, it was just not a structure that could properly support her. So she did, what a lot of kids did during that time, even to this day, she ran away. She hitchhiked from Las Vegas all the way to California's Bay Area, to Berkeley. See, at the time, her logic was she wanted to be around other fellow creative types, other kids her age who were just kind of in that same space, lost souls just trying to come together and be brought together with creativity. She was looking for a kind of togetherness and cohesion that she really just wasn't finding at home. And so she came to Berkeley. At the time, this was about a decade out from the hippie movement, and at the time, Berkeley, even to this day, is one of those kind of cultural hotspots where you find a lot of that creative talent. And so she made her way out there, and she spent a few weeks of the fall of '78 just kind of roaming around, hanging out with some of the other kids. She was homeless. She was, at the time, people used to leave their cars unlocked, and so she was sleeping in the back seats of cars. She was out on the streets. It's very different today. If you hear someone living, oh, they were homeless in the Bay Area, it's not. You think about a lot of, the unclean aspects, but the thing was, for a long time, especially before a lot of the drugs hit, being homeless was kind of something different, and she was out here. And, at first it was okay, but she realized that, that cultural pull, that sense of community, she just wasn't finding it here in the Bay. And so she decided she wanted the company of her family again. But she wouldn't go back to Las Vegas. Her parents, it was too much. So she decided she was going to hitchhike yet again. And she was going to head for Los Angeles because she had a grandfather who she loved very much down there. And so, as the way that she had gotten up there, she decided to make her way down south. On the 28th of September, 1978, Mary decided to start her pilgrimage down to Southern California. She linked up with this group of kids who was also headed down that way, and she started. But the going was tough at first, and after walking for a while down the side of the roads and the highways, she was getting tired. It was coming up on the end of the first day, and she was still stuck in the Bay Area. She was still in Northern California. And she had been traveling with these two other guys. And that's when a van pulled up right next to the side of her. The man inside the van was an older gentleman who offered her an olive branch, or what seemed to be an olive branch at the time. Yeah, I'll give you a ride. Your friends, they can't come with. I've only got room for one. There was only one seat in the van, the passenger seat. And while, one would think they could have gone to the back, he was like, no, I only have room for you, not your friends. The guy she had been walking with warned her, said, I don't feel that this is necessarily the best idea. I don't think that you'll be safe. But Mary was tired. She was just trying to look for a ride. She just wanted to go see her grandfather. And so, even against her own judgment, she decided, let's get in this van. Let's just take up the stranger's offer. She climbed into the van, and her and the older man hit the highway. And at first it was fine. He was taking the interstate the normal way out of the Bay Area. And she felt a sense of peace that she was finally headed in the correct direction. That, she had found this caring stranger to take her along the way. Within an hour or so, she, feeling at peace, finally fell asleep. And when she awoke, it was dark out. But they weren't on the interstate anymore. They were on a desolate road, traveling through no man's land. It wasn't the interstate anymore. And Mary soon realized that, ew, this is not good. And the man that she'd been traveling with had admitted, yeah, we got lost. But, Mary wasn't really buying that. They had been on the correct road, and now they were off. And the place that they were at, for context, the road they were likely on is California State Route 130. A large section of that cuts through, getting to the Bay Area. There's usually two main interstates main ways that people get across the Diablo Range to get to the Bay Area. However, they were on this little road, and the reason I say they were on this road is we'll get into it later. But they were on this little road that was this winding little road, about 60 miles or so, that cut through this mountain range. The interstate would have been faster. And it's at this point that Mary was starting to realize it's time to go. We should leave. But just before Mary started freaking out, she got an opportunity. The man stopped, said he needed to use the bathroom. So she figured, this older guy, I can outrun him, I'll be fine. But she needed to do one thing before she could leave. She hopped out of the van, tying her shoe, getting ready to run down the road. And all of a sudden, the world went dark. Unknown to Mary, the man had crept up behind her and struck her in her head with a large tool. She fell to the ground unconscious, and he dragged her back into the van and restrained her. He then subjected her to some of the worst treatment imaginable for hours on end. Truly horrific. She was, we'll say, conscious for some of it. And after all was said and done, after he finally released her from her bindings, he decided it was better if there was no evidence of what had happened, and he proceeded to sever her hands at her wrist with an axe. Thinking being the no fingerprints, no way to identify who she even was if they even found her. He then tossed her body down a ravine where she ended up in a concrete culvert. He drove off, making his way back towards the interstate, thinking, it was all said and done with. The thing, though, is that Mary was not dead. Not by a long shot. Mary didn't really remember what had happened to her while she was in the van or being tossed, but what she does remember next was a voice calling to her. A voice that she later recognized was God. And he was telling her to get up, to wake up, to keep moving. And she talks about how she very vividly remembered arguing and just being like, no, I just want to rest. Just let me lay here. I'll deal with it later. Not even realizing the extent of what had just happened to her. But eventually that his voice just grew inside of her head and got loud enough until where she did wake up. And when she came to, she realized what had happened, and she realized that despite how bad the shape she was in, she needed to stop this man. She needed to catch this awful human that had come after her. And so, remembering something from her childhood, she had spent some time in the Philippines, and over there she had learned one of the things that you could do to stop blood from flowing was to use dirt to help it congeal and stop flowing. And so she stuck what was left of both of her arms into the mud, and eventually she was able to get it to stop. And when she was finally able to get it to stop, she climbed this 30-foot ravine, and again, where she was found was the Diablo Range. which is why I said it was State Route 130 or 130 that they were on. But anyway, she manages to climb the ravine and eventually is able to flag down this young couple who are obviously terrified of what they saw, seeing this 15-year-old girl with no hands. But they take her, and when she gets into the custody of the authorities, she's able to relay an immense amount of details, including a description so good the attacker's neighbor recognizes him 10 days later and turns him into the police. He gets brought in, and she testifies against him at trial. She was able to help him get convicted to the maximum sentence, though unfortunately at that time it was only 14 years. While this was a great victory and a great, a great case for her, her immediate survival and her ability to get this guy convicted, it wasn't smooth sailing for Mary. In 1987, her attacker was released on good behavior, and Mary had been living in California at that time, and as soon as he was released, she left the state. That same year she moved to Washington because she was fearful of him coming and finishing the job. And it turns out she would have every right to be fearful, because in 1997, 10 years later, her attacker would go on to take the life of a woman in Florida. But yet again, Mary rose to the occasion. She flew to Florida and she testified him yet again. And this time he was sentenced to death. Even though he was sentenced to death, it would take a few years for that him to be put down. And while they were preparing that, life decided to act a little bit faster, and he would later pass in 2001 from cancer in a prison hospital. Even with his passing, it was still very hard on Mary, especially to get over the trauma that she had endured. In an interview from an article, she said, "That's how hard it was on me. I still don't trust just any man or any woman for that matter." And this was years, even after he had passed. Even with all that had happened to her, the attack, the losing of limbs, the trauma from the experience of having to testify against her attacker twice, just dealing with the trauma and the stress throughout that process and afterwards, Mary was able to overcome all that. She started using prosthetics within weeks of her losing her hands. And she has learned to be very independent, even learning to walk her dogs and even paint. She is a talented artist. She sells her own artwork. She became a victim's advocate. She testified to many committees, and she was even able to pass some laws, including the Singleton Law, or the Singleton Bill, which, had it been active when her killer or when her attacker was first convicted, he would have never been able to be released from prison early. And she was not only able to overcome being a victim, but she was able to stand up for the behalf of other victims and potential people who could potentially be victimized. She had a family. She had 2 sons. And even after 2 divorces, she was finally able to find a man who she could truly trust and be comfortable around. And I think at the time of writing this video, they've been married for nearly 20 years. She still lives in Washington. And while she does struggle some days, she did have a key piece of advice for something that has allowed her to heal over the years. I held on to such hate, anguish, and sorrow for so long. The most important thing people should do is let go of their hate. You don't have to forgive or forget, but let go of the hate long enough to realize how good it feels when it's all gone. Mary is an incredibly strong woman. And while experiencing such a horrifying thing at the age of 15 would be hard on anyone, it would be hard for a lot of people to want to continue to keep going on. Not only did she continue to keep going on, she made it through. And while it was not always good, while it was not always smooth, while it may have been rough, while she may still deal with that trauma, she's actively unpacking it. She's actively being independent. She is actively choosing as hard as she can to not let it affect her. To be the artistic personality that she was when she was a kid. And I think that this story goes to show that her story goes to show that not only can you survive something this so horrendous, so awful, but even after permanent damage, can you still heal and have a long, fulfilling life? Mary, right now, she's in her 60s. And she is still taking every opportunity to love and enjoy her life and enjoy the people around her. And I think that that is the epitome of what we are capable of as humans. Is really a shining example of how we can bounce back and how we can not only survive, but we can thrive. Thank you. I hope to see you again for another story.